Andre stayed with them, probably 10 to a dozen years. We're not quite sure just how many. But we do know through his journals some of the experiences he had with them. He figured out right away that if he was to serve the tribe well, he needed to learn their language. They spoke a very difficult to learn Native American dialect called Algonquin. And Father Andre proceeded to learn that language. He was French Canadian, so he quickly devised a way where in a dictionary format he would have a page of common Algonquin phrases and in the page next to it the common French equivalent. So he began to learn their knowledge, their language, and the elders of the tribe began to learn some French. Fortunately, before he became a priest, he learned some science techniques. Specifically, he learned some newer agricultural techniques that the Indians did not know yet. He was able to teach them those techniques, and they began to have productive gardens quite quickly. The second thing he did, which just blows my mind when I think about it, he did a study of the current flow both in the bay and out in Lake Michigan proper. And from his data, he was able to advise the Potawatomis how to make their fishing more efficient. He also was a master with the children of the tribe. He writes in his journals about the wonderful campfires that they would have together. He played the flute, and they did all kinds of singing and dancing. And one of the most startling things he did, right there at that point of land, which I already referenced for you, he built a humongous cross, some 26 feet high, which he had whiteboarded. Well, you might say to yourself, why did Father Andre go to all the work to build that humongous cross? Time out. Here's a very important person with the white hat. That's Dan, our boil master for this evening. He's going to take care of a fish boil. And he's going to put in the first two components of the traditional Northern Door fish boil. One, a significant quantity of salt. Now, this is not just any old ordinary kind of salt, folks. This salt is special. It's so special it has four words in its title. The salt Dan is using is Morton's. Morton's Hard Kosher Salt. Morton's Hard Kosher Salt. And then in addition, we're going to put in a substantial quantity of medium-sized red potatoes. So we've got in the boiling water the potatoes and the salt, and we'll let that burble a bit before Dan brings other components. A word or two about the history of the fish boil. The fish boil came to Northern Door County late in the 19th and early in the 20th century, and it came via immigration from the Scandinavian nations, most notably Norway and Sweden, but also Denmark. They brought with them the fish boil experience. Up in a little hamlet just north of Ellison Bay called Gills Rock, there have lived for many, many generations 4 or 5 families of commercial fishermen. And all during the 20th and into this century, those fishermen, even this morning, set their alarms for about 4 a.m. And they are out in their fishing boats netting for whitefish in the Bay of Green Bay. So you need to remember that the fish we use tonight, the fish used always in Door County fish boils, is whitefish. And you need to remember that most of the netting for whitefish occurs in the Bay of Green Bay. By the way, the fishermen out of Gills Rock bring that catch in around noon, and if you're in Gills Rock, it's interesting to watch them unload the catch and get it prepared to sell to local restaurants, sell to local residents, etc. For the first 60 years of the 20th century, the fish boil was only enjoyed by the locals, and it became especially a wonderful tradition of churches. And even in 2014, those of us who get up here from Florida by the 1st of April, we enjoy those traditional church-sponsored fish boils all the way through the spring until all of you arrive. it was in 1960 that a couple of local owners of restaurants noticed that there was an increasing number of people coming to Door County each summer as visitors, like all of you. And so they had the idea, you know, those visitors might like the fish boil. So they began to add it to their menu. So that right now, as I'm chatting with you, there are probably 7 or 8 other restaurants doing exactly the same thing. Same menu, same methodology. But I could tell by looking at your faces, this was a highly intelligent group. You could have gone to those other places, but you came here because you knew in your heart of hearts that this was the best fish boil in Door County. We're the only ones who tell stories. And furthermore, we have a full buffet dinner in addition to the fish boil. So I hope it brought your appetites. You'll be extremely well fed. Now back to the Potawatomis and Father Andre. Remember, he's built this humongous cross. Why did he do that? Well, he had 2 reasons. Number one, as the Potawatomis became more successful in developing their 2 communities along the Mink, word got out to neighboring Indian tribes. Boy, those Potawatomis found paradise. They got wonderful fishing and hunting, and they understand that they're growing all kinds of crops. Maybe we need to get in on that action. And the last thing Father Andre wanted was other tribes to encroach upon the fishing and hunting grounds of the Potawatomi. The last thing he needed was a war between the tribes. And at least while he was here, they averted such a disaster. The second thing just annoyed him no way. Every once in a while, without any consultation, any notice to anybody, the younger braves would get in their canoes up along the Mink. They'd paddle like crazy right through Rowley's Bay and out into Lake Michigan proper. They'd make a left-hand turn, and they'd paddle hour after hour after hour northwest. You know where they were headed? A place many of you been to, everybody knows, Mackinac Island. And what were the Potawatomis doing back in the 1600s, going to Mackinac Island? Well, the word got out. If you can make it to Mackinac, a lot of fire water up there, a lot of alcoholic beverage. So the younger braves would go off on a bender for a couple of weeks, then they'd make it back into the Mink River Basin, and of course the tribal elders and Father Andre would have to sober them up and get them back to work. So you see, the purpose of the cross was put there by Father Andre because his hope was that as the braves, especially the young ones, are paddling around Rowley's Bay thinking about getting into trouble, they'll remember his Christian teachings and stay out of trouble. Well, I guess he was successful, but maybe not so much after he left. By the way, that cross stayed in that location for many, many decades, and when University of Wisconsin and other Wisconsin colleges send their archaeologists and their sociologists and other scientists here to look for Indian remains, they found the foundation for this cross. So we do know for sure that it did exist. Now comes 1830. Father Andre has left many decades before for other church duties. In 1830, Congress was in a bad mood. We're used to that. They were in a foul mood in 1830. They wanted to stop the Native Americans from moving further east. So they established a new law. All Native Americans have to live west of the Mississippi. Well, hey, we're 300 miles plus from the Mississippi. This meant that the Potawatomis and other tribes located in northern Door County had to make a move. Furthermore, the feds said, if you don't move quickly, we're going to send the federal troops in. Well, the Potawatomis knew they were no match for the federal army, and so very, very slowly, but very, very obviously, they started to break camp here, 1830, and move west, move west, move west. You'll notice how I underline the word slowly. In the short haul, the feds got their way. But you know, it's 2014, and the Potawatomis are a thriving tribe even today. So in the long haul, of the Native Americans did well despite that law. Now I'm going to jump ahead. I left you in 1830. Now I'm going to move to about 1838 so I can tell you more about me. Remember, I'm Peter Rowley, and I'm a real nasty fellow. I live down there in the middle of the territories, just like the Potawatomis, and I'm generally dissatisfied by the way my life is going. I want to be a commercial fisherman. No need for that down in the middle of the territories. Furthermore, I have a longing desire to spend the rest of my life in a relatively high degree of solitude. I'm reminded of Greta Garbo's famous line from that movie, "I long to be alone." Well, that's the way I felt back in the late 1830s. And so I got in my canoe, and just like the Potawatomis, I got on the Fox River. I started to paddle north. Oh, almost forgot to tell you. In the canoe with me were a couple of gals. Now, don't get any ideas here. One of those gals was my wife, but I've never been clear about who the second one was. I told the historians who interviewed me that she was a member of my family. So the three of us were on the Fox River, and we start paddling up. Time out. Here's Dan for the next component of the fish boil, which is a big supply of onions. So now, latecomers, we have the onions, the potatoes, and the salt burbling away in the boiling water, and we're awaiting for the arrival of the pièce de résistance of this entire event, which will be the whitefish, which we'll talk about in a minute or two. All right, back to my story. The gals and I make it up into the Bay of Green Bay. We paddle along for a few days later, and all of a sudden, in front of us is this gorgeous vista. It's the bay at Sturgeon Bay. And I said to the gals, "Man, this looks like a fabulous place to settle." So we beached the canoes in Sturgeon Bay. I told the gals, start gathering wood. We're in Wisconsin. We got to keep a fire going 24/7, 365. And furthermore, I said, while you gals are building the fire and keeping it going, I'll look for a place to build a lean-to. So we've been at work at that project for, maybe 8 or 10 days. When I woke up one morning and looked out, there are people everywhere. I want solitude, no people around. So I said to the gals, back in the canoes. So back we go, out into the Bay of Green Bay, and we keep paddling northbound along the western shore of the peninsula. Now, folks, I believe every one of you has, if you haven't, you must, travel on State Highway 42, which follows that western shore. And if you have, you notice that every few miles or so, you came to another gorgeous bay. If you didn't like the one at Sturgeon Bay, no problem. Wait 15 minutes and you'll be in Egg Harbor. Oh, you didn't like the bay at Egg Harbor? No problem. Wait another 15 minutes, you'll be at the one in Fish Creek. And on it goes, up the entire peninsula, one gorgeous bay after another. Well, try the one out at Ellison Bay while you're here. Absolutely gorgeous bay. Well, the gals and I encountered all those gorgeous bays. At a couple of them, we beached the canals, started to build a home site. But again, people kept following us. So back in the boats, and we paddled through Death's Door, no big problem there. And very, very quickly, we came into this gorgeous bay. It was 1840, and we knew that this was the place we should settle. So I managed to put a lean-to together, and we had a permanent housing over in the trees there. And we found that the hunting and the fishing was quite good. We were able to grow very, very productive gardens. We stayed there through 1840, stayed there through 1841. In 1842, I went out to check my traps one day. Remember, I'm a curmudgeon. I don't let the grass grow under my feet, and I'm always looking for a better deal. And while I'm out checking those traps, a couple of hunters walk through the area. And they see me, and they hail me down and say, "Hey, do you live in these parts?" I said, "I sure do. I live right along the bay here. In fact, you can see the roof of my lean-to over there in the woods." Well, one of these guys said, "Tell me, how's the fishing out here in the bay?" And I said, "Hey, I think it's pretty good. We've had a pretty fair luck out there. Every once in a while, we run into a dry spell, but I have to say, we've been pretty well satisfied. Well, this guy says to me, supposing I were to tell you about fishing grounds that were even better than out here. I said, I'd be very interested. They told me. I hollered out, hey, gals, we're ready to break camp back in the canoe. So, back in the canoe we get. It's 1842. And we paddle out into Lake Michigan proper, take a right-on turn, paddle for about 6 or 7 days, and come upon a spot now seen on the road maps of Wisconsin as a small city named Two Rivers. For you Wisconsinites, it's just north of Manitowoc, right on Lake Michigan shore. We settled there. I became a well-known and successful commercial fisherman, and the gals and I had a pretty high degree of solitude for the last years of our life. Now, you know, what I wondered about for many, many years was why the good people of Wisconsin would name a bay after a guy who only stayed here for 2 years. Would seem to me they'd want to save that honor for somebody who made a substantial contribution and stayed a long time. But no, they awarded it to me. Took me a long time, but I finally figured it out. What the people of Wisconsin were doing was to give an honor to me and the gals because we were the first white folk to follow the Potawatomis here and to establish a little housing community for a couple of years. Well, now we're going to bounce ahead till the 1850s when a very well-known logging company from Racine, Wisconsin, named the Cogswell Corporation, came through with their agents looking for new timberland to purchase and to log. And they looked in a southwestern direction beyond where the inn now stands, and they saw this humongous, gorgeous stand of cedar trees. And they bought that stand of cedars and began to log it in a serious way. One of the first things they did was to build at the tree line beyond the red buildings across the way a dock. You could hike over there, take you 5 minutes, and look to the left at the tree line, and you'll see where the vestiges of that dock are. We still use it occasionally. More about that in a few minutes. But from that dock, the Cogswells kept a humongous logging operation going for a long period of time, and they were very successful hauling out a boatload after boatload of lumber to be used for telegraph poles, telephone poles, and especially for railroad ties. Then comes along in the 1860s a wealthy entrepreneur from the state of New York by the name of C.A. Rogers. And he must have come right to about where we're seated, and he looked over and he watched that lumbering operation, and he said to his friends, boy, I'd like into that, because I think that in addition to logging, we could get some more business operations going right here. So he convinced the Cogswells to let him into their business, and in addition, right here, he built a very significant, large trading post. That trading post had rooms for rent. It had both a grocery supply section and a hardware section. It had medical offices because, by luck, Mr. C. Rogers had a father-in-law who was a retired physician. It had an ice house. It had a sawing mill. It had a mill for the construction of cedar shingles for building. It had a cider mill. This was a thriving operation that kept going through the 60s, the 70s, into the 1880s. So things are going well here. Workmen began to move their families, build small houses. We had a U.S. post office on site, a church on site, and up the road on ZC, the school was built, and there's the bell from the school, which will be ringing for you in a few moments. So things are going smashingly well for the lumbering, but in their heart of hearts, the Cogswells and Mr. Rogers knew they couldn't keep this going forever, because what they were doing was taking lumber out, by the millions of square footage and doing nothing to conserve, to replenish the forest, or to find other logging grounds. So slowly, the logging business began to shrink very, very seriously until late in the 1880s. They had to give it up, and they had to call it quits. And at that point, the buildings that both the Coxwells and Mr. Rogers had built began to fall in disrepair. Now, folks, here comes the great moment of truth. Dan and his associates are bringing forth a supply of whitefish netted this morning in the Bay of Green Bay. Whitefish netted this morning in the Bay of Green Bay. You'll notice that it is cut into chunks for cooking purposes. A whitefish found in all of the Great Lakes is a mild-tasting fish, runs 13, 14 inches in length by average, and again, we chunk it. Remember, it is a fish that is netted by the commercial fishermen, and it is found in great supplies, especially in the Bay of Green Bay. Now, Dan's going to put the whitefish in the boiling water, and while it's in there, what's going to happen is that as the fish are cooking, they're emitting their fishing oils into the cooking solution. So Dan has the challenge of, before he takes these items in to serve you, of getting rid of as much of that oily, gucky water as he can. So what he's going to prepare for is referred to you up at the black placard here as the boil-over. More about that in a few minutes. Back to my story. Well, after logging gave up, in came a very wealthy wild man entrepreneur from the state of Washington, believe. His name was Hanson, and Mr. Hanson had friends located in Milwaukee, and they kept sending him telegrams out in Tacoma. Hey, you gotta get east. You gotta see this gorgeous Door County, especially you gotta see the Mink River. It's the most beautiful spot on earth. And they kept hammering it. Finally, he got on the Transcontinental Railway. He came across here. He met his friends from Milwaukee right here, and they hiked over to the Mink River. And God, they just fell in love with the place. And by gum, Hanson turned to his buddies and he said, you know what we ought to do? We ought to toss in a little money, each of us, and we'll build right here a planned community, and we'll sell properties. And so that's what they did. And in order to do that back in the 1890s, what you had to do was produce a lithograph. You had to hire an artist to draw a picture of what you wanted to sell. Then you'd print it on the very finest of parchment papers, and then you'd ship it out all over the place. So, Mr. Hanson got the name of a well-known artist from Sturgeon Bay. That man came up here, met Hanson and his friends along the Mink, and he drew this planned community, which was to be named Tacoma Beach. All the streets were there, all the streets named. The map showed where the schools would be located, the churches, the shopping center, the public library. They even drew where the public beach along the Mink River would be located. And then Hanson, in his rush to make money, conned the artist in drawing the Mink River as a mighty waterfall leading into Rowley's Bay. Well, all of this got printed on the lithograph. It went out all over Green Bay, all over Milwaukee, all over Chicago. You know what happened? A lot of people forked up money sight unseen. Well, after a couple of years, mid-1890s, a group of these purchasers began to run into each other. Hey, you heard from Hanson? What's happening up along the Mink? What have they done with our money? And finally, a small group of them got mad enough that they agreed to meet right here and go on over there and see what Hanson had done. So on the appropriate date, they met here, and they hiked over to the Mink River, and when they got there, they found a swamp. The whole place was underwater. It became the biggest real estate scam in the history of Door County. Well, now it's the 20th century. one disaster after another. You remember, World War I, the Great Depression, World War II. Nothing happened here, except lots of fishermen, lots of hunters continued to come through because the area became well known for those sports. But in terms of any kind of economic development, forget it. It was not until 1947 when a retired jeweler from the city of Milwaukee by the name of Louis Casagrande came through here with some buddies. They were just hiking through, and he must have stood right where the ground rises up there in the rear, and he looked out, and he stood there looking at that view, and after a few moments he said to his buddies, "Tourists!" And that started the great tourist movement into this area, which of course all of you are exemplifying this evening. So there we had it. Mr. Casagrande built a small inn right here. He called it Rowley's Bay Resort. He kept it going with a struggle from 1947 to 1970, had a small dining operation. Then in 1970, the Peterson family, out of Sister Bay, just 8 miles down the road, purchased this property, and in a series of stages, they built this fabulous inn. The Peterson family still owns the property, and I suspect somewhere during your dining experience this evening, you'll meet the manager who is the daughter of the founder and keeps this marvelous place operating at top speed. Just one little footnote. You'll remember a few moments ago I spoke to you about an exception to the netting in Green Bay story. Every once in a while, the whitefish, without any consultation with us at all, decide they're bored with the Bay of Green Bay. So they form in humongous schools and they swim through Death's Door into Lake Michigan. And when they do, of course, those fishermen in Gills Rock have to take note. Instead of getting up at 4 a.m., they have to get up at 3 a.m. because it takes longer for their boats to get through Death's Door and out into Lake Michigan, where they now have to conduct their netting. But they do so 3 or 4 times during the spring, summer, and fall. And when they do, they bring their catch not to Gills Rock, but right to that old dock that I've told you about here at Rowley's Bay. Now, a quick review. Remember, while I've been chatting these last few moments, the fish are cooking. They're emitting their oils into the cooking solution. Dan needs to get rid of that, so he's going to create the boil over, at which time he's going to throw kerosene on the fire. Notice how loudly I say that. Please, it's not going in the fish. Some people get very nervous at this point. Kerosene's going to go on the fire. Now, we have to take safety precaution because you won't believe the heat and smoke that's generated from this experience. So please give your attention to Dan, and he will take it from here. But don't go anywhere after we're through with the boil over, because I got a couple of other little announcements to make to you.
We'll thank Peter later. Okay. So the wind is going this way, folks. You want to go over there, and at least to the sidewalk and back.
Yeah, folks. You got to get everybody up.
You just going to feel a lot too much heat. I know. So if you